Welcome back to another episode of Surviving and Thriving, the Breaking Badass podcast. I'm your host, Bridget, coming at you from Raleigh, North Carolina, and I am sitting here enjoying the rain safely indoors from Tropical Storm Deb. Quite a great time to be actually recording a podcast episode if I had to make a choice myself. And today's episode, we're going to be diving into a deeply personal and complex topic, parental alienation. It seems to be a topic that so many of you approach me about. And when you do, I often bring up the same story, and that's my own. So in this episode, we're going to be exploring my own experience as a child, as I was alienated from my healthy parent, my mom. We're also going to take a look at the history and the controversy surrounding parental alienation syndrome, a term that emerged in the 90s. This episode aims to shed light on the psychological impacts of this phenomenon and how understanding it can help those affected find a path to healing. Growing up, I didn't realize the extent to which I had been influenced and alienated from my mother. It wasn't until my 30s that I began to understand what had really happened. It was through EMDR therapy, after leaving an abusive marriage, so many things. It had led me down that path of really just revelation. And this revelation led me on a mission. And I'm still on the mission, actually. I want to obtain my family court files. They lie somewhere around Denver, Colorado. I have it in my soul to go out there and find them. Now, this would have happened sometime in the 90s, so hopefully I can still get my hands on them. From what I understand, from the stories that were shared with me and what I've been able to piece together from these stories, I believe that there were a few key players. I believe that there was a guardian ad litem who misled the court. And this misleading came from misleading that was received by the guardian from my paternal grandparents and my father. And my father was a pro se litigant, oddly enough. Despite my mom and my maternal grandmother tireless in their efforts to regain custody of not only myself, but my two brothers, nothing changed. There was involvement from Child Protective Services in my life, many times. There had been reports of child abuse made by teachers, neighbors, even my grandmother and my mother. And I, a victim, survivor of sexual abuse and assault. Although as a child, I never reported it. My situation remained the same, you see. I've discussed this in an earlier episode this season. Parental Alienation Syndrome was first introduced by psychiatrist Dr. Richard Gardner in the 1980s. Gardner described parental alienation syndrome as a disorder that arises primarily in the context of child custody disputes. Well, can we not say that's a red flag right there? According to Gardner, one parent, the alienator, engages in behaviors to isolate the child from the other parent. The alienated parent, often resulting in the child expressing unjustified hostility or fear towards the alienated parent. Now, Gardner's work sparked significant controversy. Critics argue that PAS lacks scientific rigor and it's often misused in the family court system, even still today. to discredit the actual legitimate claims of abuse that's going on. The term parental alienation syndrome remains contentious and is not universally accepted in the psychological community. Many experts argue that while the behaviors described by Gardner are real and damaging, labeling them as a syndrome oversimplifies the issue that can be weaponized against abuse victims. It's a young science, and the misuse of the term in courts has caused additional harm to children and parents alike. But the real victim are the children. I am a victim of this terrible, terrible syndrome that started in the 90s. Junk science is what it's now referred to. My personal journey was fraught with both fear and confusion. You see, when professionals from both CPS and other agencies visited my home, and I grew up in Central Florida at this time, I was too scared to ever tell them the truth. I would simply say I was fine. I was always scared that I was being listened to by my stepmother, who was the primary individual who was physically abusing me. I was afraid of retaliation or any other additional punishment if I were to speak out. You see, this is not uncommon among children in such situations. Perhaps that's why I identify so closely with my clients' children. Child psychology tells us that children are highly susceptible to manipulation and coercion, especially from figures of authority in their lives. The fear of being in trouble or causing more conflict often silences them. And this is more true in children of divorce. So why did it take until my 30s to realize what had actually fucking happened to me? Well, often children who are alienated from one parent internalize negative messages about that parent. These messages can become so deeply ingrained into us that they persist into our childhood, only unraveling when faced with new perspectives or evidence. So for me, it wasn't until I went through my own ordeals in family court and I was seeing things from a different perspective through my own suffering in family court that I started to see the truth. And I started to then gain a crucial footing in understanding my own past from my childhood. I started to understand the coercion and manipulation firsthand. And I could see how my own children were suffering, their fear, their sadness, and something started to click. As I would hear stories of more and more people that I started to help as an advocate and a co-parenting coach, I started to understand. If you're going through something similar, if your children are facing something similar, please know that you are not alone. The journey to understanding and healing from parental alienation, also known as DV by proxy, is challenging, but there are resources and professionals who can help us. There's amazing counselors, support groups, legal advocacy groups. They're all crucial components of this journey that we're on. My father has now passed away. All but one of my paternal grandparents are passed away. And I haven't confronted them about what occurred. I don't feel that there's a need to. I have my peace in knowing that I know my truth. I no longer communicate with my family. My mother passed away 13 years ago, this Friday, the 9th of August. And I dedicate this episode of this podcast to her. I think it's important that we educate ourselves on the complexities of coercion, manipulation, DV by proxy, and understand how to approach this particular situation with critical thinking skills, but also an informed mindset. To all of my parents out there listening to this episode, fighting for their children, and to all the children who have lived in this situation or still living in this situation and navigating the fallout of parental alienation, DV by proxy, I see you. I hear you, and I stand with you. My voice will continue to be your voice. This is a difficult path, but with resilience and support, it is possible to heal and to reclaim your narrative, your truth. I want to thank you all for joining me on this very deep and personal episode of Surviving and Thriving today. If you found that this episode is helpful, please share it with others who might benefit. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. And until next time, my badass warriors, keep thriving, because surviving is just the beginning. If you have any questions or want to share your story, feel free to reach out on social media channels or via email. Your voice matters, and together we can continue to create a community of support and understanding. This is Bridget, signing off. Stay strong, stay resilient, and keep breaking badass. Till next time. This is Surviving and Thriving, the Breaking Badass podcast, where we talk about all things from dating after divorce, healing from abuse, childhood trauma, and so much more. I'm your host, Bridget. Thanks for joining me.